Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at magical realism in more depth. Here's a quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez in which he says, "Surrealism comes from the reality of Latin America." We're going to be looking at the political statement that this means and then also how it might have an impact on the development of magical realism as an art form. So our objective for this video, at the end of this video, you should be able to define the characteristics of magical realism and be able to notice them happening in a text, as well as be able to analyze how Gabriel Garcia Marquez uses this technique in Chronicle and how it might impact the passage's meaning. So let's first talk about the roots of magical realism. We want to talk about what is realism actually. So the realism movement was a reaction to the Romantic movement that happened in the 19th century. The Romantic movement idealized reality. It didn't present things as they were. It presented as things should be. So landscapes, they were more beautiful. Emotions were more exaggerated. Bodies perfected. And we see that represented in artwork too. But then after the 1848 French Revolution, artists and literary and authors wanted to find ways to represent what they were actually seeing. So they started to take more photographical representations of reality. And so what that might look like for an author is speaking in the vernacular, like we see in Middlemarch by George Eliot, or representing banal everyday activities happening in text or even in artwork. Then we also see common people being emphasized rather than just elites. So that gave way to magical realism, which magical realism, its origin comes from Franz Roh, who is a German art critic in 1925. He was the person who first coined this term, and then it became much more popular as an artistic movement in the 1940s in Latin America. Some of the characteristics of magical realism, it presents these realistic and a realistic environment, but with magical elements imbibed within it. It talks about the extraordinary occurrences as an ordinary part of everyday life. So here are some different elements of magical realism. First off, the structure usually incorporates time shifts and complicated plots. It presents events from multiple standpoints, such as alternates detached with involved narrative voice. Likewise, it can also shift between characters' viewpoints and internal narration on shared memories or relationships. Time also is frequently just displayed as cyclical instead of just linear. What happens once is sometimes destined to happen again, which distorts our understanding of time and our sense of chronology. So time becomes more cyclical, and time also might appear absent. Another technique that an author might do is to collapse time in order to create a setting in which the present repeats or resembles the past. By doing this, it might mirror the past against the present or characters against one another. And so we see things being mirrored over and over and over again. This also, well, some other elements of magical realism, it would reflect some realistic ideas. So the setting might be a usually historical, geographical, or cultural context, and then it depicts normal life, features people in the lower class, for instance, and what their everyday activities might be. You also will see this in some of the sensory language that's being used. You'll get a lot of sensory imagery that relates to the everyday and your sense of smell, your sense of touch, your sense of taste. And those are going to be some things that will be elements of magical realism. But in terms of magical elements, to be looking out for dreams, omens, prophecies, a sense of divine justice that is ruling over fate, any instance of levitation, flight, telepathy, telekinesis, the experience of the horrific and also the inexplicable. We'll be talking about carnivalesque later on, and then any sort of elements of spirituality influenced by myths, fairy tales, folk tales. The tone when someone uses magical realism is typically matter of fact. It's a matter of fact statement of the extraordinary as if it's just an everyday part of the ordinary life. So the atmosphere the reader might experience is this ambiguous atmosphere where there's multiple meanings. We might experience some sort of surprise or shock that the characters in the text might not experience. And then we might also sense the marvelous, the things that are extraordinary. So, what is the purpose of magical realism? What point does it make? So, one of the things it first does is it helps us question what is real by taking the idea of realism, the way of taking a photo and presenting life as it is by adding magical elements. The authors are making a claim that some things with myth and the supernatural are more real than they would be just on their own. So it questions what is real, our assumptions of what could be or should be real, and it presents different views of reality. This is really important, especially when we consider the political implications of this, especially because magical realism has come into bloom in Latin America, especially during the 50s, the Cold War era. It was during a time of huge revolution and transition for these areas that had previously been colonized, but who might also still be experiencing the effects of neocolonialism. So, with all of the political things that were going on, fantasy has always been a part of the Latin American perspective. And for them, magical realism isn't this colonial idea from Europe that they're stealing. Instead, it's this sort of nationalistic sentiment that they are able to create, that Latin America has this culture, this life, and a purpose outside of being a colony. And so in the 1960s, as the world was beginning to nationalize, this magical realism was a statement for Latin American independence at the height of the Cold War politics. Magical realism in Latin America was often used by writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez to tell the stories of those on the fringes of society, which inherently became a critique of political power and influential people. Magical realism implicitly critiques society and particularly critiques the elite because magical realism often tells the stories of people without wealth instead of focusing on the royalty of a region. As a genre, magical realism has been used to critique politics from anti-imperialist, Marxist, feminist, and a combination of all three perspectives. What unites these writers politically is that they wrote from the margins of society outside of the dominant power structures and central cultural centers. Which brings us to number 3. Magical realism is paradoxical by pairing things that seem at odds with each other, such as time and space, and showing time as cyclical rather than linear, which is our usual understanding of time, the supernatural and the mundane, and having those two meet together, the marvelous of everyday. By bringing in all of these different paradoxes, is making a claim that 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 Latin American people's way of viewing the world is just as valuable and perhaps offers a reality that is other, that is different, and as important as the hegemonic forces that have been in charge of them previously. So let's take a look at some examples. First off, we have already studied Beloved, and this is an example from the very beginning of Morrison's Beloved. Both Morrison and Gabriel Garcia Marquez were influenced by William Faulkner, and so they had very similar elements of this magical realism. In this part of Beloved, it says 124 was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way, but by 1873, Setha and her daughter Denver were its only victims. The grandmother, Baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking at a mirror shattered, that was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettle full of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor, soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the door sill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, the months even, when nothing was disturbed. No, each one fled at once, the moment the house committed what was for him the one insult not to be borne or witnessed a second time. So in this example, we see the ordinary. We've got a kettle full of chickpeas smoking. We have mirrors, and we have a family that's living in a house. And yet it's imbued with the supernatural. There seems to be a force or a haunting that is coming into this very realistic place that is wreaking havoc on the people inside. And Morrison uses this to help us question the realities of living with the haunting of a past of slavery. How is she going to get through to her audience and really explain to them the impact that slavery has left on the people who have escaped from it? How is she going to do that? If she just uses realistic imagery and it tries to explain it that way, it might not come through our heart in the same way that using the supernatural in a sense of metaphor can overcome that and present a real reality. So in this example, I want you guys to take a look at how Gabriel Garcia Marquez uses magical realism in this excerpt from chapter 1. I'm going to pause the video and you guys will be able to read this on your own, and I want you to tell me what are some of the elements of magical realism you see occurring here, and what do you feel like is the purpose of it in this section. I'm excited to see your responses.